I'm Dr. Helen Hazen. I'm currently a teaching professor in the Department of Geography and the Environment at the University of Denver. And I teach a variety of classes at the intersection of human health, environment, and sustainability. This particular book on population geography that we're talking about was designed to be an introductory undergraduate text, focusing really on the kind of pivotal role that human population issues play with respect to global patterns. And the subtitle, Social Justice for a Sustainable World, emphasizes really how closely linked population issues are to ecological and social stability and sustainability, as well as to human rights and social justice. So the topics that are covered in the book, population growth, population decline, migration, use of resources, urban systems, and so on, they all take as a starting point the idea that how humans operate at the population scale has really very important implications for global systems. And again, particularly the sustainability of those systems for both people and the environment. So population scale is a really important level of analysis, and the ways in which people organize their societies are influenced by both broader structures, things like the global economy, political forces, new patterns of globalized connectivity, and then the tensions that these broader, large-scale processes have with the goals and aspirations of individuals. And so this is leading to really dramatic new ways in which individuals and communities interact with one another. And that, again, has powerful implications for the ways in which people use the earth. So this population scale of analysis is particularly significant. So just to give a few more specific examples, for instance, our food systems have been transformed at the global scale by globalized methods of production. And then that, though, on the local scale for individuals changes the opportunities associated with rural life. And so looking at these two scales, the population scale and then the individual scale, is really, really important. Another example would be that we have new forms of government evolving with new international and subnational pressures on government. And these are changing the ways in which government provides social safety nets, that provides care for the elderly, education for our children, etc. And population issues, again, are at the center of many of these challenges. So in particular, changing demographic structures. So to give one example, aging populations and falling birth rates are placing really new pressures on the old economic expectation that this constantly growing workforce will keep raising living standards. So how we're going to deal with that in the future is going to be really interesting. We're going to have to work out new ways to work smarter and more efficiently with a shrinking workforce. Meanwhile, at the other end of the spectrum, in other places, we have continued population growth, which is straining those social safety nets in other ways, in the opposite direction, putting pressure on affordable housing, increasing demands for things like food and water, services like education and healthcare. And these paradoxical trends of both population growth and population decline are really what makes the current population moment so interesting. On the one hand, ecologists are concerned with the pressures of growing population straining our resource base. On the other hand, economists are closely monitoring how these diminishing populations in certain regions are straining the generous welfare state that we put into place in a post-war period when we had rapid economic and population growth. So I think that population is just at a really, really interesting moment at the moment. We're at a really interesting inflection point. And so further study of these sorts of topics is going to be really, really important as we work out where we're going to go next. Yes, so population issues clearly are deeply intertwined with environmental issues. Again, the sort of sustainability focus of the book really recognizes that as an absolutely pivotal point. As biological beings, humans create waste and they use resources, and there's really no getting away from that. So every additional individual on Earth is going to have some environmental impact. That is simply an ecological reality. However, the situation gets more interesting because there's a deep-seated controversy, of course, over the relative contribution of population size versus consumption patterns with respect to environmental impacts. And so again, fully understanding the role of population is really important for drawing useful conclusions. Is it simply that there's we simply have, quote unquote, too many people? Or is it more that the way that people are interacting with their environment that's problematic? Many of us have heard the comparison that, an average American family of 3 or 4 is using far more resources than, say, a rural Pakistani family of 8 or 9, something similar to that. And this is really the root of the population consumption debate. In reality, of course, we have to recognize that both population size and consumption patterns are significant. But if we're going to recognize environmental concerns in a social justice framework, we really do have to balance concern with population with concern with consumption. So if we look at climate change specifically, we can consider the importance of growing populations as well as consumption patterns when we think about the challenges of excess carbon. It's both growing populations and growing affluence or consumption patterns, more meat consumption, more transportation, more heating and cooling of houses as people become more affluent, that are driving the release of more and more carbon into the atmosphere. And again, at the top end of the spectrum, we have to recognize that there is a very small proportion of very affluent individuals at the top that are representing a very large proportion of carbon release through air transportation, etc. So as a global community, we know that we need to reduce emissions, but if we're going to think about climate change in a social justice framework, we have to again balance this population consumption debate and recognize that it's going to have to be high per capita emission countries that are going to have to do the lion's share of the work if we're really going to address this in a kind of social justice framework. And then that social justice framework is also important if we think about the impact of climate change on particular communities. So turning to impacts now. So we have coastal regions anticipating rising sea levels, those at high elevation experiencing melting glaciers, diminishing irrigation water, communities in semi-arid regions that are often seeing increasingly erratic rainfall, and Arctic populations who are experiencing some of the highest rates of warming. And if we look at who it is that's being most affected, many of these communities currently at greatest risk are indigenous, rural, of low socioeconomic status, and often marginalized in a number of other ways, which represents a really kind of important intersection of differing vulnerabilities. And so again, thinking in a population framework allows us to take these subpopulations and analyze what are the unique challenges that are affecting these different subpopulations so that we recognize that climate change doesn't affect everybody equally. Yes, a really interesting question. We know that population growth is now slowing. And in fact, as I've mentioned, we're facing some localized situations of pretty dramatic population decline. But the population story for the next 50 or so years is going to be one of net population growth. That is really an inevitability. Given the challenges we already face with providing living spaces, resources for 8 billion people, the idea of adding an extra couple of billion is really quite hard to comprehend. Meanwhile, we also hope that we're going to be able to pull more people out of poverty over the next 50 years or so, many of whom are living in those same countries that are experiencing some of the fastest growth. And so how do we provide additional resources and opportunities for people in the poorest parts of the world, which are also getting the double whammy of also having this rapid population growth. So in the past, of course, we used draconian population policies in many countries that really limited people's reproductive freedoms to try to diminish population growth. But I think we've learned from our past experience that the social justice challenges that are associated with those sorts of programs are really potentially too high to bear in most cases. And in fact, giving people reproductive freedom actually does seem to slow population growth significantly. Some of the countries that have seen some really impressive population growth did not use draconian population policies that really restricted people's social liberties, but instead just provided people with increased reproductive opportunity. In other words, women in particular typically choose to have fewer children when they have the opportunity to do so, and they believe that those children will survive and will have the opportunities for things like education and rising living standards. And so we actually don't need to force people to have fewer children to slow population growth. That's the amazing kind of win-win that we found with population decline, is that it has happened almost as a sort of side effect of modernization and other development processes. So let's come back to the question, what would a fair and just population policy look like then for fast-growing youth populations? Well, I would suggest it's one of reproductive education and autonomy, not of strict restrictions on population growth, easy access to a range of effective family planning options. But just as important is offering people equitable social support programs that enable this new generation to seek out education, healthcare, affordable housing at reasonable cost. Another aspect to this, of course, is that we have this future with rapidly diminishing population in some places and still growing populations in others, which suggests that we also need to pay a lot of attention to migration policy. Fair migration policies that really allow for international mobility would be beneficial to both sides of that spectrum, both ends of that spectrum, both growing populations and diminishing populations. So instead of locking the world down, actually allowing these fast-growing young populations to join the workforce in rapidly aging regions really makes economic sense as well as social justice sense. And so this is going to be, again, a really important issue to watch into the future, as currently our political scene seems to be going in exactly the opposite direction. So this is going to be a really, really interesting future point.